Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. You know, there's been a bit of a drip over the last, over the last 3 years, but perhaps even more notably over the last couple of weeks about the so-called deep state. This is something that's now being conceded that it exists. It used to be sort of a moniker to sort of dismiss people who believed in the conspiracy theories and who actually advanced this idea there's a deep state and so on and so forth. And it's to be dismissed, deep state conspiracy theories. But you had New York Times columnist James Stewart talk about it, recently promoting his book on Comey et al. You had, over the weekend, a panel discussion with former heads of the CIA that was moderated by Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan. And acting director of the CIA, going back to the George W. Bush administration, John McLaughlin, he said this.
Sparked by a complaint from someone within the intelligence community. It feeds the president's concern and often used term about a deep state being there to take him out.
Thank God for the deep state. I mean, I think, everyone here has seen this progression of diplomats and intelligence officers and White House people trooping up to Capitol Hill right now and saying, these are people who are doing their duty, who are responding to a higher call.
Is that right? One of the things that's reported that Lieutenant Colonel Vindman said was he was concerned that President Trump was undermining U.S. foreign policy. The president is undermining U.S. foreign policy? I thought, and Britt Hugh made this point as well, I thought the president sort of set U.S. foreign policy. So U.S. foreign policy is set independent of the president and imposed on the president? And who elected Lieutenant Colonel Vindman to do that? This comes on the heels of retired Navy Admiral William McRaven's op-ed in the New York Times calling on the removal of the president. Our republic is under attack from the president. That was the title of his New York Times op-ed. And he talked about the need to remove the president. I mean, essentially, he said, new person in the Oval Office, and the sooner the better. That's sort of a remarkable thing for a retired admiral to say. It's a remarkable thing for Bill Kristol to be rooting for some sort of military coup when he references senior level military, including the likes of Admiral McRaven, who are critical of President Trump. Here was Admiral McRaven explaining himself after that op-ed came out just a couple weeks ago on CNN with Jake Tapper.
If you want to destroy an organization, any organization, you destroy it from within, you destroy it from without, and then what you do is you convince everybody that you're doing the right thing. So when you take a look at what the president has done, he's undermined the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, the Department of Justice, the State Department. He has called the press the enemy of the American people. And I will tell you, I've fought a lot of America's enemies. The press is not the enemy of the American people. Then you take a look at undermining us from without. He's obviously left our allies, the Kurds, on the battlefield. We feel like we have betrayed them. He's undermined our NATO allies. He's taken us out of the JCPOA and the TPP. And really, the international community has lost faith in America. And then throughout the course of all of this, he's convinced us that he's doing it for all the right reasons. And I think that is really what is troubling. But if I can, the other part of the op-ed that I think is equally important is that I think Trump forgets that we are a nation of values, that we are not just transactional. He's a transactional president. He believes that it's only good if it is good for us. But he forgets that we're the same nation that fought Nazism and fascism and imperialism and communism and terrorism. And we did that not because it was just good for us, but because it was the right thing to do. And the men and women in the military and the intelligence community and the law enforcement community, those people, those Americans believe that these values are important. I don't believe the president fully understands that.
For more on this topic, as well as his book, Sailing True North, we're pleased to be joined by Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, currently an operating executive with the Carlyle Group, and again, the book, Sailing True North, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character, which, by the way, I mean, tracks going back to Sir Francis Drake to then more modern-day heroes like Admiral Chester Nimitz in World War II. Admiral, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's great to be with everybody in Chicago this morning.
Before we get to some of the particulars of your book, because it's really about, from perusing it, the character of these 10 admirals you profile, and so it speaks to leadership and so forth. What about what we're hearing from retired CIA director, retired Admiral McRaven, about the leadership coming from the Oval Office and about the so-called deep state, which is now, I guess, now a term that even the deep state is using. How do you process all of that?
Well, I spent 37 years in uniform and, spent a fair amount of time in Washington and then much more time, of course, out at sea and deployed and in combat and so on. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that there's some kind of like coordinated effort in Washington to undermine elected officials. I never saw that. I think that it's true there are career professionals who are civil servants, and they might work at State Department, they might move over to Department of Homeland Security, they might move over to Department of Justice. They kind of move around. There are military folks who progress through their careers and come into Washington and take a tour. There are CIA officers who take a tour at Langley, but then go out to the field. I don't think it's a coordinated effort. On the other hand, are there individuals who work in Washington who are not elected, who are part of the process of creating foreign policy? And as you said a moment ago, yes, the president is absolutely in charge of foreign policy. That's what the Constitution says. It's tough for him to get up in the morning and drive the entire foreign policy of the United States, which is more than just what's happening in Ukraine. It's a global enterprise. So there has to be some kind of professional undercurrent that can help the president shape his views and move forward. So, yes, there are individuals, many of them in Washington, who are not elected and are part of foreign policy. But I think the president ultimately needs that support.
Well, do you think President Trump's phone call to Ukraine that everyone's, going over with a fine-tooth comb put our national security at risk?
I think that if we had withheld the military aid ultimately from Ukraine, that would have undermined our national security. So I applaud the fact that we ended up sending the military aid. And I often pushed the Obama administration hard to send real military aid. In terms of whether the president tried to withhold that to advantage in domestic politics, like a lot of folks, I'm waiting to see this investigation come out and see what was actually said, and then I'll make judgments going forward, Amy.
But then you have, Joe Biden, right, as the point man for Ukraine under President Obama, and as you referenced, the Obama administration chose not to sell Ukraine Javelin missiles to help provide for their defense. President Trump has. And Joe Biden, you either get rid of this prosecutor or you lose $1 billion in loan guarantees from the United States. Is that undermining our national security?
Dan, I haven't seen a factual basis for what you just alluded to. I'd be willing to look at a report or a documented set of facts. And as always, my job as a former military officer is to call them like I see them and keep the ball down the middle of the court. And, that's at the end of the day why I wrote the book, Sailing True North.
By the way, Joe Biden, he said that it's on video. He said that at a Council on Foreign Relations conference. That's what Joe Biden said. So I'm just going based on what the former vice president said. But I hear what you're saying. It's just, I think it's difficult as this impeachment inquiry goes forward. People see historical comparisons and how they were treated, not only by members of Congress, but also by members of the military now speaking out against the president who are retired and can do so, which is fine. but and that they're having a difficult time, processing what the standards are, or if they change based on the occupant of the White House. And if they're changing based on the occupant of the White House, then we have a little problem because the standards should endure.
Yeah, Dan, I think a good point to be made here is that as voters, we get to decide individually what those standards are, right? I mean, that's the essence of democracy. And so as we look at our elected officials, be it the president, who's in the spotlight in this regard right now, or our senators, our governors, our mayors, as voters, we get to decide. And we can say, here are the qualities of character that I think are really important. And here's how this candidate matches up to them. And they may or may not be the same set of standards that another voter in this republic comes up with. So what I tried to do in Sailing True North was take it out of this intense personal frame that we all feel at the moment and say, hey, let's step back and look at history here. And because I happen to be a retired admiral and I know admirals, I chose admirals as kind of a framework. So I looked at 10 admirals going back 2,500 years, back to the ancient Greeks. You alluded to correctly, Sir Francis Drake. We looked at Nimitz, Rickover, Zumwalt, Hopper, Nelson, many of them, 10 of them. And in each case, tried to look dispassionately at their character and what were the decisions they made, and then how did that impact them going forward. And I think the purpose of the book is not about every individual political crisis we face. The purpose of the book is really, as individuals and as voters and as citizens of the Republic, how do we frame this idea of character going forward? And history can show us a lot.
Is there one of these 10 admirals you profiled that was sort of a particular model for you? And if so, who and why?
Yeah, the one that I really like, and I'm not a big guy, I'm like 5 foot 5 inches tall. One that I liked was Lord Nelson, who was a British admiral in the early 1800s. And he won this epic battle called the Battle of Trafalgar, which defeated Napoleon and effectively saved Great Britain from being invaded. And I liked him because he was short, the same way I am. I liked him because he was fierce and dedicated and gave everything to his task. I liked him because he took care of his sailors. That meant a lot to him. So I really like him a lot. On the other hand, to the character point, he was an adulterer. He had an affair. He had a child out of wedlock. And particularly in the early 1800s, that was unbelievably scandalous. And so, like all of us, he had his great traits and he had some flaws as well. And I think reading a life like Nelson's, and the way the book is structured is each of the admirals, there's a chapter about him or her, and it pulls out their story and then makes a bit of an assessment.
The book is Sailing True North, 10 Admirals and the Voyage of Character. He is former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, retired Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral, thanks so much for joining us, and good luck with the book.
Thanks a lot, Dan and Amy. Have a great day in Chicago.
You too. Take care.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.